We might come to the Bible thinking about our own culture more than thinking about the culture of the Bible. But those things, even though they're less obvious than something like the clothes they wear or how long it took to travel somewhere or something like that, those things that are more under the surface can really be more important. They have to do more with how people thought, how people related to one another. And these cultural differences are going to be really important for better understanding the concept of redemption in the Old Testament. So this is getting into what Sue was talking about a moment ago. A big difference in our culture and the time of the Old Testament, or ancient Israelite culture, is that Israelite culture was tribal. It was tribal. And in a tribal culture, the family is truly the heart of society, the foundation, or maybe at the center of society. Now, we might often sometimes still say that the family is, or at least should be, at the foundation of society, but it was at the foundation to a much greater degree in the time of the Old Testament and in ancient Israel's culture. So in our society, it's nice if the family can provide for one another and look out for the less fortunate members of the family or look out for the less fortunate around them in the neighborhood or something. It's nice if the family can do that, but also the state and other institutions as well exist that create economic opportunities and that give aid to people and things like that. Well, in Israel's tribal culture, those types of things fell almost entirely on the shoulders of the family. It was up to the family to provide for one another. It was up to the family to provide for the marginalized or the less fortunate. And it was really up to the family to even enforce laws. It was up to the family often to decide if some criminal act has happened. It may be up to the family to decide who's going to live and who's going to die, or they will decide who's going to get sold into slavery or something like that. The family is key for all these kinds of things. And in ancient Israel's tribal culture, the head of the family was the patriarch. The patriarch. The patriarch is the oldest primary male in the family. And that means that providing for the family, keeping the family safe, discipline, all of these things ultimately rested on his shoulders, on the patriarch's shoulders. And like Sue was saying a moment ago, when a woman married in this culture, when a woman was married, she would leave her patriarchal household and she would be joined to her husband's household. And she was then fully under the protection of that household. So she transfers from one household to another. And this meant, the way this system worked, meant that if a woman had both her father and her husband, if they both passed away, and she had no male children, then she was really in a bad situation. She was really in a bad situation if that were to happen. So in ancient Israel's world, in their culture, what matters for an individual is who the patriarch of his or her family is. That is how an individual related to society. Who is the head of your household? And this is quite a bit different from today. Actually, it's very different from today. We are not primarily identified in society based on who the oldest male in our extended family is. That's just not the way we go around relating to the world around us. But this is the way it worked in ancient Israel because their society was arranged differently. So based on that description, based on the way the family unit worked with the patriarch at the head of the household, clearly the patriarch was someone who had a lot of power. Patriarch was someone who had a lot of power. And so whoever was next in line to become the new patriarch, and the person who's next in line is typically the firstborn male in a family. Whoever is next in line to become the next patriarch would receive typically a double portion of his father's inheritance, and also they would receive special privileges as they're growing up that his siblings, his brothers and sisters, would not receive. So if you're in line to be the next patriarch, you get some special treatment as you were growing up in this family. So as we think about those things, all of that might sound pretty unfair to us. It might sound kind of frustrating that this is the way the system works. That if you're a male, things are great, and especially, well, you have a chance to be the head of a household if you're a male, and if you're the firstborn male, then things are really great because you get these special privileges growing up. And if that sounds unfair to us, that's totally understandable. This is just not the way our culture works at all. But I do want us to keep in mind that all of this happens because the next patriarch had to be groomed. The patriarch had to be groomed to be ready to assume the responsibility for the entire family. And so when he became patriarch, everyone in the family would ultimately look to him for, they would look to him as the source of their livelihood. And they would do this without having the types of social safety nets that we have in our world today. So this is a huge responsibility for the patriarch. The whole family's looking to him, and there's not a lot of alternatives if things start going bad. So he has to make sure that he manages this family well and provides for this family well. So this is important to remember. If you're the patriarch, or if you're in line to be the next patriarch, it's not all luxury and special privileges and everything's great. This is a huge weight on a man's shoulders if he's the head of a household. Can I get to you in just a second, Mary? Let me make it just a couple more points here. The last thing I want us to note, and Sue touched on this already, is that even the physical dwelling space for ancient families was centered around the patriarch. So a family unit, a household, and we know this through archaeology and things as we've uncovered ancient homes, but the extended family members would live in their own housing units that were really close together, and they all opened up onto a shared courtyard. So that connected them all to one another. And this entire living arrangement was typically referred to as the Father's house or the Father's household. That might make us think of Jesus when he says, "In my Father's house are many rooms." Well, they would refer to that whole setup as the Father's household. All these units for families that open up onto a shared courtyard. And then there would be burial places nearby, near the Father's household. And that way, when relatives passed away, they would be buried there, and that would solidify their claim on the land, that it's theirs, because family members are buried there. That can help us appreciate, for instance, in Genesis, when Abraham purchases land in Canaan so that he can bury Sarah. You do that, that's a claim on the land, a stake on the land as yours. So these are some basic features of Israelites' patriarchal culture. And I know I've been saying a lot that doesn't sound like it has much to do with redemption, but it will. We're getting there. This is all going to help us appreciate redemption here in a little bit. But first, Mary, I saw your hand up.
Just thinking that's kind of like being a king, a prince, it's not much different from, you had the prince and the king, they'd be with the whole family.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't have that here, but I mean, you think about over England and
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, so Mary was saying it doesn't sound all that different from a king, right? A system where there's one person on the throne governing the whole kingdom. It's like that on a smaller scale. And we think about, yeah. And we think about all the privileges that a king enjoys, right? I mean, living in luxury, best food. Ancient times, you probably have lots of wives and things. But also think about the huge responsibility. So you're right, that's like a larger scale version of the same setup. Any other questions or thoughts on this before we keep going? Okay, so again, clearly this is all way different from how our society works today. Today, the oldest male in the family doesn't necessarily have any power over the rest of the family, and he's definitely not expected to be the one to ultimately provide for them. And today, family members, instead of all living together in some type of shared compound, they're almost always free to take jobs wherever they want that might land them halfway across the country or halfway around the world. And if their family isn't able to provide for them, Well, there's often social safety nets, whether through insurance or government programs or whatever else, that don't require them to be so dependent on their family. So overall, I imagine we're probably pretty glad that we don't live in a tribal culture. And we're probably pretty glad that our society isn't structured this way. But I want us to notice a couple of things in the Old Testament where we learn about God in relationship to this family structure, this social structure. And all of this, again, is going to help us understand how redemption functioned in the world of the Old Testament and what redemption is all about. So first, I mentioned a moment ago that women who married left their father's household and joined another. And this is important because ancient genealogies, which are really important for tracing your family line, that was traced through the males. Ancient genealogies were traced through the male line. And so women typically related to the world at large by being so-and-so's daughter, or so-and-so's husband, or so-and-so's son. That women typically related to society by the men in their life. So, how does this help us appreciate some things about God? Well, in that world, when the Bible mentions women in its genealogies, that's a big clue that something really significant is going on, because ancestry was typically traced through the male line. So, for instance, I know this is a class on the Old Testament, but jumping over to the New Testament for a moment, in Matthew chapter 1, we read the genealogy of Jesus. And we read there of 4 women who were in that genealogy. There's Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and then, of course, there's Mary, his mother. Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. So of these 4 women in this genealogy, one of them is from the little, very forgettable town of Nazareth, Mary. One was a prostitute from Jericho, who then went on to live as an Israelite, Rahab. One was involved in David's adulterous sins, Bathsheba. And then the other one is actually not even an Israelite at all, but a Moabite, and that's Ruth. These are the 4 women in the genealogy of Jesus. This is the genealogy of the Messiah that we're being given. And in the genealogy of the Messiah of Israel and of the world, there are 4 women. And that should give us a clue that the Messiah and the God who sent the Messiah, they are going to operate under a different set of values from the surrounding culture. And that's something actually that if you've been in here on Sunday mornings as we've been going through the Gospel of Luke, we've noted that a lot. There's a lot of different clues, and this is just one, but there's a lot of different clues that Jesus and the God who sent Jesus are operating on a different set of values than the culture. And so when the Bible departs from this practice, that tells us something about God. Second, I mentioned that a woman who's living without a father or without a husband or children, male children, was truly in a really desperate economic and social situation. We read God in the Old Testament frequently calling on Israel in the law, and also it comes up in the prophets, calling on Israel to care for the widow and the orphan, to care for those who are most vulnerable in this tribal culture. They are very prone to being placed in bad social and economic situations. And so it's emphasized, you have to care for them. They're vulnerable. And so God has no desire to see those who are most vulnerable abandoned or destitute. They need to be attended to because of the way that system is set up. Third thing, I mentioned that the firstborn male is normally the next one in line to be the patriarch. The firstborn male is normally going to be the next patriarch. So in this society, they had the greatest privilege, right? They would be raised with special privileges and things, but then also, of course, the greatest responsibility. Well, in that culture, we should be alarmed when things don't proceed that way in the Bible. So, for instance, in Genesis, when Jacob is chosen over the older brother Esau, that's not normal. That's not the way things normally work. Or we should also be alarmed when later in Genesis, Jacob intentionally blesses Joseph's younger son, Ephraim, over Manasseh near the end of the book of Genesis. Or we think of King David. We should be alarmed when David is selected to be Israel's king, even though he has older brothers. And you may remember David's father Jesse has the older brothers come first. Why? Because they're older. This is the way the system works. But David is chosen even though he has older brothers. So all of these things should tell us that God is really interested in reversing social norms and pulling for the underdog, so to speak. So we serve a God who is not interested in just blessing the privileged and the powerful and those that this culture or whatever culture tends to put on a pedestal for whatever reason. God is not interested in just blessing them. He is interested in truly blessing all people. And these kinds of things are clues. They show us how that goes into action within a given culture. Any questions or reflections on that before we move into how this all specifically helps us appreciate redemption? Nathaniel.
Is there any guidance as to why the patriarchal society was built the way it was? Is that from God, or because I think the first time we really see that, at least in that jump, is Jacob and Esau. So was that set up by God? Was it designed by God, or was it just kind of the way they decided they needed to govern themselves?
Yeah, great question. So this patriarchal system, is that a God-given system, or is it just the way things happen to work in ancient times? I think I would go more with the latter option, because the Bible, well, you can actually kind of say a little bit of both, but I'm going to start out with the latter option. It's the way society worked, and God stepped into that society. And so in the law of Moses, for example, there are instructions that reinforce this system, but it's not because the law of Moses came up with it. It already existed, and God is saying, all right, well, here are some rules and parameters for how your system is going to work. So it's not, the whole system from start to finish is not a God-given system. It's the way society ran, and then God stepped into it and helped shape it. Now, the basic maybe ingredients for the system, maybe we could say are somewhat laid there in the opening chapters of Genesis. But that's different from saying that the whole system is given by God. So, and Paul talks a little bit about, Adam is made first and then Eve. But that's different from just giving us this whole system. So maybe some building blocks are given, but the system itself is not one that God just told humanity to have. Does that make sense? Any other questions or comments? Sue?
Just stop and think. God the Father, and then we've got Jesus, which was the Son,
Yeah.
and then we are the children. We are brought in, so it's still coming down to God
Yeah.
being the main one.
Yeah. So hierarchy, structure exists even within the character of God, and that's something we can't really see till the New Testament. Now, we'll have to be careful how we say that, because it's not to say that the Father is more God than the Son or more God than the Holy Spirit, but Jesus submits to the Father, right? So hierarchy is part of how God has created things, but the details of how that's going to work out is something that a culture formulates, kind of really, I guess, on their own, you could say.
Got Jacob in there with hair on his arms and stuff. She had something to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of God, it was more her and Jacob doing it to their father, because he couldn't see or anything. So
Right.
he got so they got it that way.
Yeah, that's right. So it's supposed to work where the oldest receives that blessing, Esau. But Jacob's mother, because of her love for Jacob, works some deception in there and rearranges things. And we can see how perhaps God is working through all of this for his will to be accomplished. But yeah, they're pulling strings to act differently from how the culture around them normally acts. All right, so we're talking about redemption tonight, and I realize it seems like we've gone maybe kind of far afield from redemption, but all of this hopefully will help us appreciate this theme some more. So how does this help us understand redemption? Well, redemption is a term or a concept that is part of this tribal, patriarchal culture. And I want us to look at a couple of examples of this from the Old Testament. So redemption is important for understanding the Bible, and it's a concept that comes from this tribal, patriarchal culture. So a couple of examples. Ruth and Boaz, the story of Ruth and Boaz. We just talked about, Jordan just preached about this during homecoming back this past July. But we sometimes think of the story of Ruth, and when we do, we often think of Ruth's great loyalty to Naomi, and we also might think of a romance story with Ruth and Boaz. Well, the first part of that is definitely true. I mean, Ruth's loyalty to Naomi is amazing, and it's prominent right there in the first chapter. The second idea of it being a romance with Boaz, not that there's no love there between the two of them, but it's a little bit of a stretch to think of it in terms of a modern day romantic story. Ruth and Naomi are women in crisis. They're women facing the kinds of desperate circumstances that we mentioned earlier because their husbands have passed away. And Naomi is not likely to have a child and raise up a future husband for Ruth anytime soon. They are women in crisis. And Boaz in that story is so impressed by Ruth, so impressed by her loyalty to Naomi, that he agrees to act as her redeemer. He acts as her redeemer, meaning that he will bring Ruth and he will bring Naomi into his household to economically, socially protect her. She can join that family household. That's what Boaz is offering. But there's a little bit more to this story. There's a problem. There's a more immediate relative who's more closely related to Naomi and to that whole family. And that closer relative, it would be their job first to protect Ruth and Naomi. So Boaz, before he can just marry Ruth, he first has to see if this relative is willing to serve as a redeemer for them. So this is how redemption, which is so important for understanding the whole Bible, is what I'm suggesting for us tonight. This is how redemption works in ancient Israelite culture. Another example, Abraham and Lot. We read about this in Genesis chapter 14. In Genesis 14, Abram and Lot, they have parted ways. If you remember, they scoped out the land, and Lot chose one portion of land, and Abram chose another. And each of them are now the head of their own father's household. They're the head of their own households. But then we read in Genesis that Lot gets caught up in this military conflict in the region where he lives, around the city of Sodom. And so Abram, being the older male, he has family and social obligations to Lot. He's the older male. So he is a really good patriarch here because he gathers the men under him and he risks the fate of his own household to go save his nephew's household. And so again, this is a good example of redemption in ancient Israelite, ancient Near Eastern culture. And then a third one, Hosea and Gomer, the prophet Hosea. God uses the prophet Hosea to make a really powerful illustration to Israel. Very powerful illustration. Anyone recall what that illustration is?
He had to marry a prostitute,
That's right. Hosea was,
have children, and he gave them the names of the children, and when they get out and play, the other children holler the name, that God was gonna leave y'all.
yeah. Hosea is commanded to marry a prostitute. And then when she, maybe, well, unsurprisingly, cheats on him, what is he supposed to do? Get her back, right? Now, if we think about this in ancient Israel culture, I would strongly doubt that Gomer just woke up one day and just said, hey, I'm not going to care about sexual morality. I'm going to go be a prostitute. That's not the way it would have worked. In this tribal culture, she probably was forced into prostitution because her own father's household fell apart. And she's desperate. She's trying to survive. So Hosea marrying her just in the first place, getting her out of prostitution, that is an act of redeeming her from these horrible circumstances that she's in. But then, when she goes back to her old sinful ways, she leaves Hosea. Hosea redeems her again by bringing her back. This is a really powerful image, right? And this is the illustration that God wants Israel to understand how he feels about them. That's really a powerful image. Charles.
Well, God wanted them to see that they was being adulterous to him with other gods and everything.
Exactly. Yes.
That's the reason why he made him have a prostitute and everything.
That's right. Yeah. The Bible, the Old Testament frequently compares Israel worshiping other gods to adultery. And God uses this image to talk about how he's willing to bring Israel back out of that. He's willing to take them back. So, with all of this in mind, I want us to look at the opening statement of the Ten Commandments. The opening statement of the Ten Commandments. This is Exodus 21 and 2. It says, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." And then after that, the Ten Commandments proceed. So I realize that the word redemption is not in these verses, right? The word redemption is not there. But can you see how the idea is there? How the concept is there? The Israelites are in a terribly oppressive situation in Egypt. And God has brought them out. He has redeemed them. So, to sum up for tonight, it's a pretty good time for drawing things to a close. Redemption is a term that was used in Israel's tribal culture for bringing someone out of terrible economic, terrible social circumstances and restoring them, setting things right, giving them security again, bringing them back into the fold, so to speak. And this is a theme that runs throughout the whole Old Testament. In a lot of ways, it's the story of God redeeming his people, redeemer, people mixed together. God redeeming his people, just like a patriarch would be expected to redeem a wayward family member or redeem a struggling family member. The Old Testament can be summed up as the story of God redeeming his people. And we'll see as we keep going that really the whole Bible is the story of God, not just redeeming his people, but God redeeming the whole world. And that comes to its culmination in Jesus Christ. The story of God redeeming the whole world through Jesus. Any questions or comments on redemption and what we've talked about tonight? Did it make sense? Great. This is going to really help us appreciate the story of the Old Testament once we start working through it from start to finish. This theme is going to really help us. So next week, we will talk about the importance of covenants to the Old Testament. Redemption helps us understand the Old Testament a lot, so also does the idea of covenant. And we'll see how the two relate together and how they can help us organize the Old Testament, and also what the idea of covenant tells us about the character of the God of the Old Testament and the God of the Bible. So that's what we'll do next week, Lord willing, or next time that I'm here, depending on what Luke decides our schedule will be. But anyways, that's all for tonight. So thanks a lot, and we'll be dismissed.